Okay, we've had a look at the introduction and what we're going to talk about. We're going to move forward now and try and get a bit of an understanding about how mental health is formed. And again, there's loads of different opinions and loads of different understandings around this, some very technical, some very straightforward. And for me, as a non-expert, just a mental health first aider with a bit of experience, quite a lot of experience of delivering mental health first aid courses to young people, or for young people and adults alike. I've tried to simplify it in such a way that it explains it, and that's how I understand it as well, just to make it a clear process. So we'll have a look now at how mental health is formed. I'll see it on the bottom here what we're going to talk about, and I will just explain some of these facts and figures and bits and bobs to you now. So first things first, it's worth looking at it a little bit like the four-corner model for the FA, that we've got a biological, psychological and social elements to how your mental health is formed. Your biological, you're born with. Typically, of course, there was a thought that genes or genetics were fixed, but the study of epigenetics has highlighted that that is not necessarily the case, and that they are influenced by your environment, your the life and what's gone before. So we've got to bear that in mind. And of course, young people in particular have some real biological and psychological changes between the ages of 10 and 11 up to the age of about 18, 19. And it's within that area and within that age group that we start to see some real emerging mental health conditions as well. If you look at 75% of mental health conditions start before the age of 18, and about 50% start before the age of 15. So we do know that there's a lot of information to support the big changes, and I'll just have a little bit of a chat about that in a minute. Of course, psychologically, those changes include a big spike of dopamine to create a hyperactive brain, and that brain really is allowing or telling the young people, the young person, to go out and take risks and not really consider the consequences too much. And it's a really important part of a young person's life, because if we wrap them in cotton wool or we take away all the risk, we then don't allow them to develop and form the tools that they need. And this can be the same, in sports and high level sports. If we accommodate and account for absolutely everything, every failure, every lost opportunity, every missed opportunity, we have a potential of setting up our young people for failure. When the inevitable, and let's think about this in real terms, there's a very small percentage of people make the final cut, in professional football, and we have to acknowledge that. And of course, then you've got to add in the social impact and the social elements of the world, how you're brought up, your frame of reference, what's influenced you, what your parents are like, your carers, caregivers, friends, family, and really the view on the world, the picture on the world that you have when you're growing up, or when your young people are growing up. And then in the middle there really is where your mental health would sit. Thinking about that, then just looking at this model, it's a bit geeky, I know, but it's just to highlight a point that we've each got, if you like, a container, we've each got a vulnerability. I'm just going to show you now on the screen. So let's just take it that we've got two containers. We've got a container this big and a container this big. We've got to fit the same amount of stresses into those, the same life stresses into those. It's clear to see that this container will fill up quicker than this container. Now, that doesn't mean that one person is any better than another person. It just means that one person may have better ability to cope or manage those particular stresses, and this person may not. So this person could become ill or affected quicker by the stresses than this person. And that's what that model, if we just go back to that model, is trying to tell us, that person A can tolerate a lot more stress than person B. So this is our person A. They can tolerate and have a lot more stress than person B, and this is our person B, without this container overflowing. And that point of the container overflowing, I want a cup of tea now, I've just seen those cups. That point of those containers overflowing is demonstrated over the next slide, where we look at this stress container. So again, thinking about your stress container, The stresses flow into that, and I've listed a few stresses around the outside here. Family, you've been dropped from the team, you've been dumped by your partner. Potential bereavement's a big one. It could be loss of family member, friend, pet, whatever the case may be. Money, of course, your fitness, especially with our sporting elite and young people. The team, socially accepted, and then multiple others. And of course, they're going to fill in. And remember those different size containers. These stresses could be, these little stressors could be the same for everyone within the team, but remembering the vulnerability, who may be more affected. So they're going to fill up bits and bobs, and we're going to get to a nice level. If these do overflow, we can see that top arrow at the top there, looking at this emotional snapping or stress signature, and we'll have a think about what that is. The container fills up and then it overflows. That point at which it overflows, as I've said there, is the emotional snapping point, or sometimes referred to as a stress signature. And that might look like a lot of things. This is where you might start to recognise deteriorating mental health in your young person or yourself. And it might look like being disengaged, being fearful, being sad, being emotional, being angry, change of habits, and lots of other different things that don't seem like the norm. So using this coping strategy at the bottom, one of the key things we've got to try and do is let this tap release and keep a very reasonable level of our container to stop it from overflowing, because we don't want to get to this point. Thinking about those coping strategies though, as adults, may have some unhelpful coping strategies that might look like maybe drinking, use of recreational drugs, use of prescribed drugs, unhealthy eating habits, poor sleep, things that we find useful to us, binge watching TV, but they're unhelpful in so much as they will allow that tap to get blocked. So eventually it will fill back up again. Helpful coping strategies might look something like exercise, training, nutritious diet, plenty of sleep, and all the things that we're told are good for us. And that's what we try and promote within our young people. Of course, our young people in this instance are within a football environment where a lot of that is promoted continuously. I've listed a few sources of stress here. Again, I'm not a football player. I've never really been very good at any sports. Maybe the egg and spoon was about my best bet. And I usually only came third in that out of three. So sources of stress for our young players I've looked at. Of course, they've still got emotional demands for your school and your college works, physical demands of sport, and the ones that you can read there for yourself. I've highlighted in bold and capitals: worry about team selection, family pressure. What pressure are we family members putting on to achieve? The expectation, the reality versus the expectation. And then, of course, poor sleep. Sleep is one of the biggest causes. We are a chronically sleep-deprived nation, and our young people need a lot more sleep than we might suspect. A young adolescent needs a good 10 hours, really, to get their quota, to make sure that they're recovering, to make sure that they're getting their brains back in order, and it's having the opportunity to reboot and reset. And of course, a lot of the social media content and a lot of life itself now revolves around being awake and communicating via the use of blue screens. So that's definitely something that we need to really consider the stresses and maybe manage in our young people. That's a broad element of how mental health is formed, really, with the biological, the psychological, and the social. The biopsychosocial model, very commonly used. But really, we're talking about it as being on a continuum, that we're all on it somewhere or another. Some days we're in a good spot, some days we're in not such a good spot. And that in itself leads to various moods and various reactions and behaviours and feelings. Some of the things that we've got to watch out for is when that low mood or that persistent sadness or that fear around something, or is sometimes referred to as maybe anxiety, lasts longer than a reasonable amount of time that you would expect for being dropped from the team or for losing a family member. And it's understanding that, understanding things that could prevent us maybe wanting to try and get help, and that's what we'll have a look at next. What can stop us getting help?